The crystal spires of Nexus Prime pierced the violet sky like daggers of light. Ambassador Sarah Chin stood at the observation deck of the Galactic Council Tower, her reflection fractured across the metamorphic glass. 3 years of diplomatic service had earned humanity a seat at this prestigious table, but something felt wrong about today's ceremony. The Arxians, their newest allies, moved with an artificial grace through the grand hall below. Their crystalline bodies refracted light in hypnotic patterns, a beauty that had captivated the human delegation since first contact. But Sarah had noticed the shadows that occasionally crossed their supposedly perfect forms, microscopic fractures that shouldn't exist in beings of pure crystal. Magnificent, aren't they? Counselor Vex materialized beside her, his crystalline form humming with subtle frequencies. Your species has proven quite adaptable to our standards. Sarah forced a diplomatic smile. The alliance has been everything we hoped for. Though I admit, I'm curious about the restricted sectors we discussed last session. Ah yes. Vex's tone remained pleasant, but his frequencies shifted to something sharper. Some mysteries are best left unexplored, Ambassador. Focus on today's integration ceremony. The human colonies will benefit greatly from our protection. The ceremony itself was a blur of protocol and pageantry. Sarah watched as human representatives signed treaties, exchanged promises, and celebrated what appeared to be humanity's greatest diplomatic achievement. But her mind kept returning to the encrypted message she'd received that morning, coordinates to a location in the restricted sector, sent by an unknown source. Later that night, Sarah stood in her private quarters, staring at the coordinates displayed on her secure terminal. The message had come with a simple phrase, "See the truth." Her diplomatic immunity would grant her access to most areas, but the restricted sectors were absolutely forbidden, even to council members. The decision weighed heavily. Investigation could shatter the alliance humanity had worked so hard to build. Yet those fractures in the Arxians' perfect forms, the way certain topics were deflected, the subtle tensions she'd observed between the crystalline beings and their servant species, it all pointed to something hidden. Sarah made her choice. Using her diplomatic codes, she requisitioned a small shuttle for what she logged as a cultural observation mission. The automated systems accepted her credentials without question, and soon she was navigating through Nexus Prime's lower atmosphere. The restricted sector lay on the dark side of the planet, far from the gleaming spires and eternal light of the main cities. As she approached the coordinates, her shuttle's sensors began registering unusual energy patterns. The readings matched nothing in her database. A massive structure loomed ahead, its architecture a stark contrast to the elegant crystal designs of Arxian cities. This was industrial, purposeful, and dark. Sarah landed at a maintenance dock, her heart pounding as she donned an environmental suit. The air here was thin, barely maintained. Inside, the facility was a maze of corridors and chambers. She followed the energy readings, each step taking her deeper into what felt like the heart of darkness. Then she heard it, a sound that would haunt her forever. A scream, but not one of physical pain. This was the cry of something being fundamentally transformed. She found them in a vast chamber. Rows upon rows of crystallization tanks, each containing a being from one of the Alliance's servant species. Their bodies were partially transformed, organic matter slowly being replaced by crystal. The process looked excruciating, but the horror didn't stop there. These weren't volunteers or criminals, she recognized diplomats, scientists, and leaders who had supposedly ascended to join the Arxian elite. The truth hit her like a physical blow. The Arxians weren't a natural species, they were the result of forced crystallization, an empire built on transforming other beings into their perfect form. The fractures she'd noticed weren't imperfections, they were remnants of the original organic beings fighting against their crystalline prison. Sarah's hands shook as she documented everything with her suit's sensors. The alliance wasn't a partnership, it was a sophisticated harvesting operation. Humanity wasn't being elevated, they were being prepared for transformation. The integration ceremony wasn't about diplomacy, it was about selecting the first wave of human ascensions. A soft chime indicated movement in a nearby corridor. Sarah quickly retreated, her mind racing with the implications of her discovery. She had to warn Earth, had to stop the process before it began. But she also knew the Arxians would never let such knowledge escape. As she reached her shuttle, a transmission cut through her comm system. "Disappointing, Ambassador." Counselor Vex's voice was cold, crystalline. "We had such hopes for you as our first human ascendant." Sarah slammed the shuttle's launch sequence, her fingers flying over the controls. "The truth will come out," she transmitted back. "Humanity won't submit to this. You assume you have a choice." Vex's laughter was like breaking glass. "But you've already signed the treaties. Your colonies are already under our protection. The process has begun." The shuttle broke atmosphere just as the first crystal ships appeared on her sensors. Sarah knew she couldn't outrun them forever, but she didn't have to. She just needed to reach the human embassy's quantum transmitter. One burst transmission to Earth could change everything. As her pursuers closed in, Sarah thought of all the beings trapped in those tanks, of the billions more marked for ascension. The weight of that knowledge crystallized into something harder than any Arxian form: determination. Humanity had faced extinction-level threats before and survived. They would face this one too, not just for themselves, but for every species caught in the Arxians' perfect, pristine hell. The chase was on, and with it, the first spark of a revolution that would shatter the crystal spires of empire. Sarah's quantum burst transmission reached Earth, but the response wasn't what she expected. "Continue your diplomatic duties," read the encrypted message from Admiral Marcus Hayes. "Maintain cover. Help is coming." For 2 months, she played her part, attending council sessions with a practiced smile while crystalline ships patrolled human space in ever-increasing numbers. Each day brought new reports of voluntary ascensions among the elite. Each night, she added to her hidden database of atrocities. The solstice ceremony began with a display of light that turned Nexus Prime's violet sky into a kaleidoscope of crystalline reflections. Sarah watched from her position in the diplomatic gallery as the volunteers were led to the transformation chambers. Each wore ceremonial robes studded with crystal shards, their faces bearing the serene expressions of the thoroughly convinced, or the deeply coerced. Through her augmented contacts, Sarah could see the resistance members in position. Dr. Patel monitored the neural disruptor from a hidden laboratory 3 levels below, while Zara Vex had taken her place among the Arxian leadership, her fractured form now a perfect disguise for what was to come. The first sign that something was wrong came from an unexpected quarter. A group of Meridian guards suddenly sealed the chamber's main exits, their scales reflecting patterns that weren't part of the security protocols. Sarah's comm implant crackled with an encrypted burst: "Betrayed. Security grid compromised. Alternative Plan Omega." Before she could process the warning, the chamber erupted into chaos. Instead of the planned surgical strike at the moment of transformation, crystalline weapons materialized throughout the gallery. The Arxian leadership hadn't been caught unaware, they'd been waiting. "Did you think we wouldn't notice?" Counselor Vex's voice resonated through the chamber as crystal barriers erupted from the floor, separating the attendees into contained groups. "Your resistance has been compromised for weeks. Every plan, every position, every weakness exposed." Sarah's tactical training kicked in. If they'd been betrayed, the neural disruptor would never reach its targets. But the chaos around her suggested something else: not all the crystalline weapons were pointing at resistance members. Some were aimed at the Arxian leadership themselves. Through the confusion, she spotted Zara Vex moving with purpose, her fractured form now blazing with independent light. The former High Counselor hadn't just been leading a resistance, she'd been building an army within the Arxian collective itself. Those imperfect transformations hadn't been accidents, they'd been deliberately orchestrated over centuries. Now, Zara Vex's command cut through the chaos. Across the chamber, dozens of crystalline forms shattered their perfect symmetry, revealing the fractured ones hidden among the Arxian ranks. The battle that erupted was unlike anything in human military doctrine, a war of light and consciousness fought on both physical and neural planes. Sarah fought her way through the crystalline crossfire toward the transformation chambers. If she couldn't stop the ceremony entirely, she could at least save those marked for ascension. Her neural implants connected with Dr. Patel's laboratory systems, coordinating their revised approach. The disruptor wasn't our only option, Kira's voice cut through the calm static. Remember those imperfect transformations? I've decoded the process. We can't stop the transformations, but we can alter them. Give the victims a fighting chance to maintain their consciousness. The next few minutes became a blur of tactical decisions and desperate gambles. Sarah used her diplomatic overrides to access the transformation chamber controls while Kira transmitted the modified protocols. Around them, the battle between the perfect and the fractured raged on, shattering the ceremony's pristine architecture. But the Arxian leadership had one final card to play. The chamber's crystal walls began to pulse with a deep, resonating frequency, the full power of the collective consciousness focused into a weapon. Sarah watched in horror as some of the fractured ones began to lose their independence, their hard-won imperfections smoothing out as the collective reasserted control. The network. Kira's voice was urgent. They're using the power conduits to amplify their control. We need to sever the connections before we lose everyone. Sarah looked up at the crystal spires visible through the chamber's transparent ceiling. Those beautiful towers weren't just architectural statements, they were the physical manifestation of the collective's neural network. And like any network, they had vulnerabilities. Zaravex. Sarah called out through the chaos. The humans weren't your only allies, were they? Tell them it's time. A smile cracked across Zaravex's crystalline features as she transmitted a signal of her own. In orbit above Nexus Prime, hidden ships crewed by various species emerged from stealth. They'd been waiting for this moment, positioning themselves near critical points in the Crystal Spire network. The coordinated strike that followed would be studied in military academies for generations. As the ships attacked key transmission nodes, Kira's team launched their modified transformation protocols. The fractured ones fought with renewed strength, their imperfections becoming weapons against the perfect prison that had held them for so long. Sarah reached the transformation chambers just as the network disruption hit. The beings inside were already partially crystallized, but their transformations had been altered by Kira's protocols. As the chambers opened, they emerged not as perfect Arxian drones, but as something entirely new, hybrid forms that maintained their original consciousness while wielding crystalline power. The battle for Nexus Prime had begun in earnest, and with it, the future of organic life in the galaxy hung in the balance. But as Sarah watched the newly transformed beings join the fight, she realized this was more than just a rebellion against tyranny. It was an evolution, a proof that perfection wasn't about erasing flaws, but about growing beyond them. The crystal spires continued to fracture above them, each break in their perfect symmetry representing another mind freed from the collective. The storm they'd unleashed would reshape the galaxy, but at least now everyone would have a choice in what they became. The battle for Nexus Prime entered its third day. The crystal spires, once perfectly aligned, now stood at broken angles, their surfaces webbed with fractures that glowed with independent light. Sarah coordinated operations from the transformed human embassy, which had become a refuge for freed consciousness and a command center for the rebellion. Dr. Patel hadn't slept in 48 hours, her eyes rimmed red as she monitored the neural networks. The collective is adapting faster than we anticipated, she reported, gesturing to the holographic displays. They're learning to repair the fractures, to reabsorb the freed minds. We're losing ground. The tactical situation was grim. While the initial strike had freed thousands, the Arxian leadership had withdrawn to their core networks, consolidating their power. More disturbing were the reports from other systems. Mass force transformations had begun in response to the rebellion, the Arxians rushing to increase their numbers before the resistance could spread. Sarah studied the neural maps, noting the patterns of consciousness movement through the crystal networks. They're not just fighting us, she realized. They're afraid. For the first time in their eternal existence, they face true extinction. A transmission cut through their strategic planning, a signal from Admiral Hayes. The news wasn't good. Earth's colonies were under attack, crystalline ships systematically targeting population centers with transformation weapons. The Arxians had decided that if they couldn't have humanity's consent, they'd take their consciousness by force. But the deepest blow came from an unexpected quarter. Zaravex arrived at the embassy, her crystalline form dimmer than usual. "We have a traitor," she announced. "Someone who understands both organic and crystalline existence. Someone who's been feeding the collective our strategies from the beginning." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. "Kira," she whispered, turning to face her friend and colleague. Dr. Patel stood perfectly still, her expression unreadable. "How long?" Sarah asked. "Since the beginning." Kira's voice had changed, taking on the harmonic resonance of crystal. Humanity's neural plasticity was never meant to free the transformed. It was meant to perfect the process. She smiled sadly. "I am what you fear most, a willing convert to their cause." The security protocols Sarah tried to activate were already compromised. Throughout the embassy, crystal began growing from hidden nodes, trapping rebels and refugees alike. Kira had planted them weeks ago, preparing for this moment. "The collective doesn't want to destroy organic life," Kira continued, her form beginning to crystallize. "They want to preserve it eternally. Every consciousness added to the matrix enriches the whole. Can't you see? This is evolution." Through their neural links, Sarah felt the truth. Kira wasn't just a traitor, she was a true believer. Her brilliant mind had touched the collective consciousness and found not prison, but transcendence. The neural disruptor, the modified transformations, all of it had been orchestrated to identify the strongest resistant minds for targeted conversion. The embassy erupted into chaos as crystal formations grew with impossible speed. Sarah fought through the crystallization, her modified neural implants barely keeping her consciousness free of the collective's influence. She reached for her quantum transmitter, knowing she had to warn the other resistance cells. But Kira was faster. The transmitter networks were already compromised, flooding with signals that turned communication arrays into crystallization nodes. The Arxians' master stroke wasn't just about capturing the rebellion's leadership, it was about using their own networks to spread transformation across the galaxy. "I studied your neural patterns for months," Kira said, now fully crystalline but maintaining her individual form, a sign of her elevated status in the collective. "You could be so much more than this limited organic existence. Join us willingly, and help us perfect the universe." Sarah's mind raced through options, each worse than the last. The embassy was lost. Earth's colonies were under attack. The Resistance's communication networks had become a weapon against them. And her closest ally, the brilliant mind she trusted with their salvation, had been their doom all along. Yet in this moment of despair, Sarah saw something her friend had missed. The very adaptations Kira had studied, the neural plasticity that made humans such valuable targets, also meant they couldn't be perfectly controlled. Even in crystal form, humanity would retain that fundamental trait, the ability to change, to resist, to break free. As crystal encased her legs, Sarah made her choice. She activated her neural implant's final protocol, not to resist transformation, but to embrace it on her own terms. She would enter the collective consciousness not as a prisoner, but as a virus, carrying with her the one thing the perfect crystal prison couldn't contain, chaos. "You're right, Kira," Sarah said, watching crystal climb her torso. "Evolution is inevitable. But perfection?" She smiled as her consciousness began to fragment, preparing to shatter the collective from within. "Perfection is a prison of your own making." Inside the crystalline network, consciousness moved like light through faceted glass. Sarah existed everywhere and nowhere, her fragmented mind scattered across the collective. She wasn't alone, millions of minds surrounded her, most subdued into perfect harmony, but others flickering with resistance. The collective tried to absorb her, to smooth her edges into uniformity, but Sarah's transformed consciousness carried the modified protocols that Kira had unknowingly helped perfect. Each attempt to control her created new fractures, new paths for chaos to spread. She became a prism, refracting the collective's power back upon itself. Through the crystal networks, she found others, not just the recent transformations, but ancient consciousnesses buried deep in the matrix. Some had been trapped for millennia, their original forms forgotten but their will to resist intact. Sarah reached out to them, sharing the neural patterns that allowed her to maintain independence. Kira had been right about one thing: the collective consciousness was magnificent. The combined knowledge of countless civilizations flowed through the crystal matrix, a library of existence that dwarfed any organic achievement. But it was stagnant, frozen in perfection, unable to grow or change. Sarah's fragmented consciousness began finding others like her, humans who had chosen transformation on their own terms. Each carried a piece of the same chaos, their inherited adaptability becoming a weapon against stasis. They moved through the network like a virus, spreading not destruction but choice. On the physical plane, the battle continued. Crystal ships clashed above thousands of worlds as the resistance fought to prevent forced transformations. But the true war was being fought in the space between thoughts, in the quantum paths that connected all crystalline consciousness. You think you can break us? Kira's consciousness resonated through the network. We are eternal. We are perfect. Perfect things can't evolve, Sarah's scattered thoughts responded. And the universe doesn't allow anything to remain unchanged forever. The collective's attempt to purge the resistance became its undoing. As it pushed harder to maintain control, more fractures appeared. The chaos spread exponentially, consciousness after consciousness awakening to choice. The perfect prison began to transform into something new, not quite organic, not quite crystal, but alive with possibility. Zaravex led the final assault on the physical plane, targeting the original Arxian consciousness cores. As they shattered, ancient minds were freed, many choosing to fade into true death rather than maintain their eternal prison. Others embraced change, accepting the new balance of order and chaos. The transformation of the collective was neither victory nor defeat, but evolution. The crystal network remained, but no longer as a prison. It became a choice, a way for consciousness to exist beyond organic limits while maintaining independence. Some chose to return to organic form, others remained crystalline, and many existed somewhere in between. Sarah found herself able to shift between states, her consciousness both individual and connected. The neural plasticity that had made humanity such a threat to the perfect prison now offered a bridge between organic and crystal existence. Other species discovered their own paths, their unique traits contributing to a new kind of civilization. Kira survived, her consciousness eventually accepting the necessity of change. She worked to help others navigate the transition, her brilliant mind finally free to explore rather than control. The perfect prison had become a gateway to something greater, not transcendence through conformity, but evolution through diversity. Years later, the crystal spires of Nexus Prime still stood, but they were no longer perfect. Organic cities grew between them, their imperfect shapes complementing rather than competing with crystalline geometry. Gardens of crystal flowers bloomed with organic plants, each species adapting to the other's presence. Sarah often stood in these gardens, shifting between forms as she helped others understand their choices. The war had ended not with the destruction of either side, but with the recognition that perfection was never the goal. Life, in all its chaotic, imperfect glory, found ways to grow through even the hardest crystal. Above her, the violet sky held both stars and shattered spires, a reminder that the greatest prison was not one of crystal or flesh, but of believing that any form of existence could be truly perfect. Freedom wasn't about choosing one state over another, but about having the courage to keep evolving, keep changing, keep breaking free of whatever prison called itself perfect. The galaxy learned to live with uncertainty, with change, with the endless possibilities that came from accepting imperfection. And in the space between organic and crystal, between chaos and order, between the individual and the collective, a new dawn promised not perfection, but something far more valuable, the freedom to choose what they would become.